Hey folks, Lars and Halleck here. Are you a fan of Lars and Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. So if you want to support me, you can go on my Patreon, patreon.com/LarsonHalleck, and give me some money. Also visit paypal.me/LarsonHalleck to give me money. You can also buy my book, visit my website, or go to my Twitter and Gab. If you support me enough, I'm gonna make Lars and Halleck the movie, in which me and my friends will play grab ass in a public park for 5 hours and thoroughly embarrass ourselves. All I need is $90,000 to do it. And now, our scheduled programming. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we're entering the real shit. This is the part of Moviebob's book that 90% of you probably came here to see. This is where Bob gets really uncomfortably personal about his relationship with Super Mario. What do I mean by this? You are not ready for this, but here we go. Part 2 of Super Mario Bros. 3, Brick by Brick. Mario and Me. My life in the Mushroom Kingdom. The time before. Mario and I were born the same year, 1981. I'm about 5.5 months older, and as such, I don't remember a world without him. Looking back as best as I'm able, I know I must have been aware of his existence as long as I was aware of anything else, but I'll confess that I was not an immediate devotee. Arcade games, both in full arcades and as individual machines at restaurants or laundromats, were fairly common then, so I would certainly have seen the Donkey Kong machine about, and I distinctly remember Mr. Rogers once demonstrating how arcade cabinets work via that same machine. I remember seeing the DK cartoon show featuring Mario once or twice, though it wasn't part of my regular TV viewing. He-Man was more my thing at the time. In fact, apart from these aforementioned ventures to arcades, most often the one at good old Salem Willows Park, video games were not much of a presence in my early life. Home gaming was well into its famous crash, and I was becoming conscious of the world around me. The only thing I really knew about it was that it was some kind of grown-up toy, since the only time I ever saw a console was when my aunt and uncle would come over to hang out with my family, and he and my father would play through a game or two of baseball on the Atari 2600. The first encounter. But I remember exactly where I was when I first connected with the NES. But it was the moment when I first connected with Mario. I was with my mother paying a visit to the home of a friend. We had met in kindergarten, and my mother wanted to meet his before we arranged a playdate. I was the firstborn, so research like this went into pretty much every decision. While our mothers chatted, my friend had something he wanted to show me in the kitchen. His Nintendo, currently sitting on the kitchen table hooked up to a TV, and there was Super Mario Bros. I was captivated immediately. I had never seen a video game, at home or otherwise, look like this. Instead of the usual black background populated by conflicting neon shapes, here was a bright blue sky with puffy white clouds over rich brown earth and green bushes. The bricks looked like bricks, the castle looked like a castle, and there was Mario, pudgy, clad in overalls and preposterous mustache, looking like no hero of anything else I'd ever seen. I watched him play for what seemed like forever, probably more like half an hour, before I was offered a turn. I was terrible at it, dying repeatedly, but I was transfixed. This miraculous machine, to my eyes, projected a cartoon that you could control on the TV, and there were more of them than this, one that looked, according to my friend, even cooler, with soldiers and bombs and cars and all manners of things. Maybe even more with this Mario person, whose image now refused to leave my mind. I was mesmerized, I was hooked, I was sold. My parents, on the other hand, would take further convincing. My brother and I were not exactly hurting for toys, and in addition, well, I was not the easiest child in the world to be raising. At the time, I was bad at school. I acted out in class, I sassed my teachers, I zoned out into daydreams and turned in poor work. I wasn't good at school stuff other than creative writing and drawing, so it wasn't as though I was in for some kind of reward that the NES could fill. Instead, my parents broke out the old Atari 2600 and said it could be mine now. It was no substitute for an NES, especially not for Mario, but it was something, and looking back, Starting with an early primitive form of gaming helped refine my skills and gave me a lot more respect for the evolution of the medium. I was filling page after page of drawing paper with painstaking recreations of the vivid images I'd seen on my friend's kitchen television. That wide open world, the fearsome enemies, that iconic hero. This is supposed to be the part where I tell you how I got the NES, how I felt, but I don't remember. That sounds ridiculous, even to me, given the subject of this book and the detail with which I recall everything else. Granted, I was 5, but still, nobody's more surprised than I don't remember when I got it. Christmas, birthday, good report card? Unlikely. One day I didn't have one, and in my mind, the next day I did. I feel strangely bad that I don't remember this. It makes me feel ungrateful. Something this important to me should have stuck in my head. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the act of procuring my own direct access to Mario was so monumental to my young mind, it rendered everything else occurring around it non-existent. What I do know is that my young life now had a clear dividing line. Pre-NES, post-NES. The new world. In any case, at last, I had it. My very own Nintendo and my very own Super Mario Bros., both of which I could play whenever I wanted for however long I wanted, provided that I kept my grades up, behaved decently, and shared with my brother, of course. Soon enough, there were other games than Mario. Duck Hunt, Balloon Fight, Zelda, Ice Climbers, Contra, the sample of classics that we remember. But SMB was the one I kept coming back to. My brother and I would take turns playing through, trying to get a little bit further. The NES and Mario were the first toy that I ever loved enough to invest into the broader culture around it. I played the game constantly, but I also devoured any shred of information that I could get my hands on. I would tear through books and magazines about games when I found them at the store. I would pump my friends for information on what was new and awesome. I read every scrap of info about Mario I could find. Especially, it was during this research that I came to know that Mario was a plumber, which made my connection to him that much stronger since that was also the profession of my adored grandfather. On the schoolyard, I learned from friends that there was a magazine, Nintendo Power, devoted only to Nintendo. That, in and of itself, was enough to interest me, but the game being advertised on the cover of its inaugural issue was a dream come to life. Super Mario 2? I just had to get a subscription, and I did for Christmas. The first issue is now framed on my wall, and I had to have that game. Like most people, I didn't find out until I was older that what Western gamers got in Super Mario Bros. 2 was actually a different Japanese game that had been completely reprogrammed to feature Mario and his friends. But the fact that Mario's second game was so remarkably different from the first made me even more invested in the character and his worlds by virtue of how big it seemed. This part 2 suggested, simply by existing, that Mario was more than just graphics and gameplay. He may have not been an especially well-developed character, but in my mind he was bigger and more richly drawn than any hero in games by virtue of his newly revealed malleability. If Mario could fight evil in the Mushroom Kingdom and Subcon, there was no limit to what he could do. In between, sometimes during sessions of gaming, my imagination would be alive with what Mario and company might be saying or doing beyond the borders of the story. Soon enough, I wouldn't have to wonder. Beyond the borders. Looking back at it objectively, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show was one of the most inane things I ever watched as a kid. An hour-long eyesore of self-conscious kitsch separated from earlier equally baroque children's programming, only in that its pool of visual references were culled from Nintendo instead of circus clowns or animal puppets. One half of the thing was a blatant rip of Pee-wee's Playhouse, with professional wrestler Lou Albano and character actor Danny Wells as Mario and Luigi having slapstick adventures in a plumbing office, populated by wacky props and creatures where every frantic physical comedy gag was punctuated by a video game sound effect. These scenes framed the show's main event, episodic animated adventures of Mario and company as they battled King Koopa through comic adventures and the occasional broad movie parody, except on Fridays, where the cartoon segment switched to a moonlighting-esque adaptation of Zelda. Of course, I loved every minute of it. However ubiquitous Mario was to my generation, we were children, and children do not run the culture. So when some sliver of the culture featured one of your video game heroes as a show, movie, comic, etc., you had to snap it up, not knowing where the next fix was going to come from. This was not high art, but it was what we had. And it solidified the idea of Mario as a real character beyond the games. This is also the first point where we started to see video games stretch beyond their own little section. You started to see them around, especially at smaller shops that imported bulk sundries from Japan where these things were more heavily merchandised. I found a small, sturdy figurine of Mario holding up a vegetable from SMB2 in a tiny outlet in New Hampshire and wound up carrying him in my pocket through grade school as a good luck totem, which I very much needed. I should stress that I did have other interests beyond Nintendo. I had become a voracious reader, thanks in no small part to my Nintendo Power subscription, and a lover of science and technology, which led me to an interest in special effects, which led me to a greater fascination with filmmaking. What Nintendo and Mario was my happy place, my constant. I wasn't having an easy time of pre-adolescence. I was quite emphatically a nerd in every sense of the word except for academic excellence. I had too much of a problem with authority to be good at my schoolwork, but I was still too weird and bookish to be accepted by my peers. Instead of dealing with this in some kind of mature fashion, I made one bad decision after another, including the classic asshole move of trying to endear myself to the cool kids by joining the belittling of the other uncool kids. A part of me will hate myself for that until my dying day. I should probably add that I was attending a Catholic school at the time, so all my issues came packaged alongside an inseparable religious guilt to boot, and the teachers had plenty of time to devote to fixing me. Me and my parents were in the principal's office a lot. They tried therapy, but I developed an unhelpful hobby of reading about child psychiatric techniques and then either purposely subverting them or smugly informing the therapist that I knew why he was doing what he was doing. I even had an EKG, which at least forced me to stay up all night playing Nintendo, so there was that. And amid all that, the most reliable escape I had was always Mario. While I could get bored with even my favorite movies or books after a while, the games were always a little bit different each time I played. So I played them, and I watched the cartoons, I read the comics, I filled my notebooks and sketch pads and the margins of my textbook with Mario drawings, and I felt my ears perk up when rumors began to swirl of Super Mario Bros. 3. When it came to Mario, the rest of the world was catching up to me. The Third Age. The lead up to the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 was unprecedented in video game launches and definitely exceeded the pageantry surrounding the release of anything I was ever interested in. Sporting events, holidays, and movies got big, overblown coverage, but not video games. Not until now. My first look at it came from where else? Nintendo Power, a short puff piece that was in my mind like a vision from God. Mario had a raccoon tail, he could fly, Bowser had children. This was also the first time I ever saw behind-the-scenes game development pictures. And I recall buying a bunch of graph papers when I saw that was how the designers plotted out sprite art. Local news shows ran interviews with the store owners. Magazines that weren't about games reported on it. Every kid I knew was excited, and then there was a movie. The Wizard is a terrible movie, and it's also one of the most bizarre examples of a children's film ever produced. The plot is a shameless ripoff of Rain Man with children. A kid, Fred Savage, breaks his younger brother out of an institution. He suffers from some vaguely defined autism spectrum disorder, and after discovering that said brother has an almost superhuman aptitude for video games, he is the eponymous wizard, schemes to hustle their way to Las Vegas so the kid can compete in a gaming competition. It was prefixed on wish fulfillment and pandering lionization, presenting the world as a gamer wished it could be. Massive crowds would assemble for a competition, but it was also still hours enough that gaming skills could help you beat the adults. For the most part, it's kind of a downer of a movie. Sad kids, angry parents, bleak backstory, and end of the 80s ennui. Oh, and it's also a Nintendo commercial. Nintendo was behind this one, so their products and services were everywhere. Not only were the kids and adults finding an excuse to play Nintendo, but a nasty bad boy antagonist wields the Power Glove controller like a Bond nemesis showing off a doomsday device. The real star attraction? Super Mario Bros. 3, of course. So, on December 15th, 1989, me and hundreds of thousands of other kids across America lined up for The Wizard. I will admit that I was one who fooled myself into thinking it was a great movie for years afterwards. But on that day, all we really wanted was to get Super Mario Bros. 3 in front of our eyeballs. Just let us see it. Please, just let us see it. Now, I've watched the film much more than it deserves, and since then I can likely quote about 80% of it. But the climactic reveal of SMB3 is burned, seared into my memory. The way that the JFK assassination was for my parents, with the way 9/11 would be 12 years from then. My god, was it really 12 years? Anyway, the climactic reveal of SMB3 in The Wizard is an all-time marvel in the theater of the absurd. He stands stone-faced and emotionless on a preposterously over-designed stage, alongside his rivals, the young girl and the Power Glove Kid. Back up on the stage, the MC's guttural bellow proclaims the words, "Super Mario Brothers 3! And there it is. The flashing yellow 3, a map screen in a Mario game? Troopas, Goombas are back? And question blocks, the raccoon tail, makes you fly. In the film, the Rocky-esque, suspenseful score drowns out the game's sounds, but in the theater, the audience drowns out the film itself. We couldn't care less about the film. This is what we came for. It has arrived. Our victory is achieved. Across the country, our jaws were agape and our hearts pounded, as the most important thing that had ever happened blazed across the screen, and before our eyes, months before we could actually play it. The Wizard wins, by the way, reuniting his broken family. Not that anybody really cared, we just had to wait to play Mario 3. SMB3 came out on February 12th, 1990, and within a few days I had a copy of my own to play. For once, I was the cool kid on the block. Since the subsequent bulk of this book is dedicated in part to my memories of playing through the game, I'll avoid preemptively repeating myself here. Instead, I'll try to convey as best as I'm able what every other part of my world was like outside the game. What sticks out was that this was the time Mario peaked in the popular culture. This is what I remember most of all. This was the absolute height of his fame and renown during the period where he was the unquestioned king of video gaming. As such, it was the first and really one of the last times that the rest of the world and I were in sync. SMB3 was the children's media story of the moment, the first opinion polls showing that kids recognize Mario equally or more so than Mickey Mouse. The rest of the world was finally waking up to what my generation, and myself in particular, had known for years. The little fat man with the mustache was the coolest guy on the planet. A new cartoon, exclusively based on Super Mario Bros. 3, had taken its place. Not in syndication, but a primetime, Saturday morning spot. There were t-shirts, toys, and knickknacks in real stores, not just game stores or weird import shops. There was even a Super Mario Bros. Happy Meal at McDonald's. To an 8-year-old, the ultimate symbol of making it. All in all, it felt like a little bit of some of the differences between me and the rest of the world might have been a matter of me being ahead of the curve. Now everybody else was catching up. This, I thought, was the beginning of a new and better world. But it was actually the beginning of the end. A boy goes to war. Marketing was all about dividing and conquering, especially marketing to youths in the 90s. Establishing an identity for your product, grouping into us and them, and getting consumers to flock to you to claim the good identity for themselves. It was the great console war of the 90s that first drew me to that kind of corporate manipulated madness. As the new decade dawned, Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Mario and Nintendo were the acknowledged kings of video games, and Bob Shipman, formerly Bob the dork who's way into his dorky video games, was now Bob the guy who knows everything about the world's hottest new pastime. Why yes, milady, I can tell you the best place to build up your EXP in Final Fantasy. What's that, sir? You can't make it through Ninja Turtles 2? I can show you a code. You may argue those are pathetic fantasies, but that's really how I figured it was going. Maybe that's how they were for a moment. But that moment, my moment, didn't last. The Sega Genesis console had been out for a few years already, touting its improved graphics and dipping a toe into the waters of combative marketing with the Genesis does what Nintendo don't campaign. But they never had a Mario, with apologies to Alex Kidd fans, and they never had any momentum beyond that of the Brand X opposition. When the SNES hit, Sega decided to go big or go home. Sega declared war. With the instantly popular Sonic the Hedgehog as their new mascot, Sega marketing switched gears from passively lauding what the products offered to aggressively attacking what Nintendo did not offer. It was a brilliant strategy. The kids who had made games big my generation were aging into double digits and soon their teens, where the pressure to cast aside childish things could have spelled doom for the medium. Although they were still mostly pumping out the same animal mascot, cutesy cartoon adventures, and sci-fi fantasy curios that had been dominating gaming up to that point, by positioning the Genesis as the cooler, more mature alternative to Nintendo, Sega was making it okay to keep your game console plugged in as long as it was theirs. Sega's campaign was relentless and blunt in the way that only 90s salesmanship could be. In Genesis commercials, sleazy store owners steered customers away from the sleek, sexy Genesis towards the stodgy SNES. An old maid censor mock-blasted Sonic while wondering why can't he be like that nice boy Mario. In playgrounds and schoolyards across the country, young gamers chose sides and memorized talking points. It didn't matter. Sega wasn't selling the games, they were selling a label. A shoebox-sized hunk of plastic and microchips that said you were on the cool team. Nintendo played the long odds, did themselves no short-term favors by maintaining a strict family-friendly image, just as violent games were becoming the rage. Just like that, my life was the ending of a downer Twilight Zone episode. Video games were in, and I was out for a whole new reason. In case you were wondering, it would never cross my mind to beg Mom and Dad for a Genesis. They would never go for it. In those days, having 2 game consoles was seen as an almost profane extravagance for a child. Besides, I was Team Mario. Sega wasn't just his enemy, he was my enemy too. To a 12-year-old, that makes sense. Outside the gaming world itself, the cultural importance of Mario and pals seemed to be waning. In 1991, a new cartoon based on Super Mario World came and went, and even my forgiving eyes knew it was awful. Sonic had 2 cartoons at the same time, both popular, and one, running on Saturday mornings, that is still remembered as one of the better cartoons of the 90s. Consoles were no longer exclusively driving the penetration of gaming franchises into the popular culture. Arcades were in their last big hurrah. Popular series like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat were enthralling the popular imagination. Video games had never been more popular, but it was looking as though Mario might be slipping into the background, a bygone hero of a bygone age. Unless he could be the one who conquered the one height of mainstream success that no other hero had surmounted: Hollywood. When I first read an official confirmation of an honest-to-goodness Mario movie in the pages of Mario Mania, a Super Mario World strategy guide that included a 32-page character retrospective which I reread often enough to qualify it as a precursor to this book, all I could feel was excitement, finally. That there would one day be a live-action Mario movie had been a dream and an inevitability as long as I can remember. He-Man had a movie, Superman had a movie, Batman had a movie. Great things got movies. Mario was the greatest thing, so obviously he should get a movie. And I would get to see the Mushroom Kingdom looking as grand and beautiful as I had always imagined. So when I read this official announcement from Nintendo Power, surely the only trustworthy source on such matters, I was elated, not so much by discovery as by nearness. I had already been waiting, and my wait was almost over. I knew Mario, and I'd grown up in the golden age of fantasy movies, so I knew what this movie of my dreams had to look like. A sprawling, colorful Mushroom Kingdom, Bowser's Domain, all fire and brimstone. Mario and Luigi in their overalls, charging through forest and tundra, fighting live-action versions of the classic enemies. A beautiful flesh and blood Princess Toadstool. Toad, probably some kind of puppet, or perhaps a little person in makeup. I couldn't wait to see what kind of animatronic effects would be employed to create the Koopas. Would they be animalistic, stomping around on all fours, or walking upright? What about the power-ups? Obviously, the Super Mario Bros. 3 super suits wouldn't be in the first movie, but surely they would need fire flowers, right? If only I knew. It took over a year to see or hear anything else from it, and every tiny scrap of information that could be gleaned was less promising than the last. And it pushed me to further denial. The Mushroom Kingdom, or was it something else now, was like a modern city. Bowser was a human. No Troopas. The Goombas were big men with tiny heads. Luigi didn't have a mustache. This is ridiculous. No, I told myself. It'll work. It'll be good. They have to change some things to make it work with real actors. The Mario movie has to be great because it deserves to be. Why would they make it if it wasn't great? I convinced myself, in spite of the natural inclination towards skepticism, that this was going to work. That in spite of all the revisions, this version of Mario would be epic and awesome in a different way. It had to be. It just had to be. That's what I told myself as a friend, and I headed in to watch it opening weekend. Somehow managing to not register that there were no large crowds like there were for The Wizard. How could I notice anyone or anything else in the world that day? I was going to see the Mario movie. The film more or less follows the lore as it was generally understood at the time, with details altered to make it filmable and able to ride the coattails of the dinosaur phenomenon kicked off by Jurassic Park. Bob Hoskins, respected British actor, was Mario and does a reasonably decent job of it. While then mostly unknown outside of the New York comedy scene, John Leguizamo was Luigi. Samantha Mathis was Princess Daisy. a Brooklyn archaeology student who turns out to be the exiled ruler of Dino Hatton, and Dennis Hopper was Koopa. It is a horrible movie. Badly acted, nonsensical, and cheap-looking even for 1993. Years later, it would come out that the production was so badly managed that everything just started getting worked out as they went. The scripts were thrown out. Naturally, I convinced myself that it was good. Not only good, but it was great. I reviewed it positively in much greater detail and to much more positivity than it ever deserved for the school newspaper. I zeroed in on the good stuff. They got the right colors. Yoshi looked good. There was a bomb. The ending promised a sequel, but I didn't wait around. I made my own, animated via D-Paint on the Amiga, imagining how the plots of Mario 2 and 3 might be adapted into the movie. I needed it to be good. I needed Mario to be as big and meaningful a franchise in the movies as he had been in gaming. Getting the movie was forever. It meant that the character in the story mattered beyond being some brief fad. Mario was not a pet rock, damn it. He was my friend, the thing that got me through the misery of pre-adolescence. I needed him to matter so that the time and energy I invested into him mattered. It was a harbinger. Things were changing. In a bad way. Things fall apart. High school was not the party that John Hughes had promised my generation, to say the least. I was still locked into the Catholic school track, but whereas my primary school was uneventful, my high school was another story. Private and Catholic, very much downtown. Mostly populated by Italian, Irish, and Greek hoodlums, whose families paid tuition to keep them from having to go to the public school with these somehow worse black and Hispanic hoodlums. In my memories, the great console wars dragged on like a private Vietnam, and it didn't help that I was still constantly in trouble at school, in and out of therapy for anger, attention, and authority issues. In 1994, the Sony PlayStation came out. Unlike other third challenger consoles, it stuck around. Since this was the booming economy of the Clinton years, it was less unusual to see more than one brand of console to a household, particularly since Generation NES was speeding towards a young adulthood, with pockets of disposable income. The identity conflict of Mario vs. Sonic gave way to a maturity conflict. Sony built the PlayStation to look more like a VCR or a stereo, utilizing CDs, not cartridges. That plus marketing campaigns emphasizing sports games and other games targeted for older people drew a stark contrast between their machine and those from Nintendo or Sega with their candy-colored exteriors, toy guns, and inescapable legacy of being childhood playthings. What made it especially rough, although not as rough, I stress, as the more universal misery of high school, for me, was how true that symbolism was. To be a geek about anything requires a level of investment that originates most often in childhood, meaning that geek culture is largely a culture of people holding onto vestigial pieces of their own childhood. I played video games because I loved them, and I loved them because I loved them as a kid, and they allowed me to revisit that feeling. Especially Mario, that was a direct connection to the golden age where I'd first discovered them. And then came Yoshi's Island. This game is today remembered as one of Miyamoto's masterworks, a triumph of every level of game design. The history of its production is a legend. Taken aback by Nintendo boss's suggestion that he make the game's appearance less cartoony, Miyamoto doubled down and made the visuals be tweaked to resemble a children's crayon drawing. The result, an award-winning classic and a stern reminder to not question the Golden Boy. While I love the game then and now, at the time, it was the game that kind of broke my brain a little bit, and it served as an early signal that my relationship with Mario and his world was changing whether I wanted it to or not. Yoshi's Island offered the tantalizing prospect of a more narrative-oriented adventure and the irresistible idea of finally setting up continuity. The game was a prequel wherein the wizard caretaker of an infant Bowser foresees the coming of the Mario brothers and schemes to kidnap them as babies to change history. Things go wrong and Mario winds up in the care of Yoshi to rescue his brother. The idea of seeing Mario's origin story had me playing through this game like a man possessed, even though by that point a teenage social life was leaving less and less time for gaming. I knew the end, I figured. Mario and Luigi would find their way back to Brooklyn. Along with seeing their Earthrealm home visualized in a game for the first time, I was intrigued to see if any indications would be made about how they found their way back to the Mushroom Kingdom. Oh, the possibilities. As the game's ending credits played out over an animation of the stork flying baby Mario and Luigi back home. Any moment now, I just knew I'd see a 16-bit New York storyline come to view, but instead, the closing text tells a different story as the bros are delivered to the Mushroom Kingdom. What? Mario and Luigi were born in the Mushroom Kingdom? That doesn't make any sense. How did they grow up in Brooklyn? Were they sent there at some point like Superman, unaware of their real origins? And how could they be Italian-American if they were from a place with no Italy, or no America for that matter? Maybe that'll be the plot of the next game. Maybe. The dissonance stuck with me for a while. I didn't have a breakdown or anything. I mean, it's not like I was in some kind of system shock. By now, I had more important things to worry about in school and life to be completely consumed by this. College prep classes, girls, sex, drugs, social hierarchy gave me headaches. It is high school after all. Mario games had been my thing, my refuge from everything else when I needed them. Now that refuge was slightly tinged with doubt. It wasn't that not being from Brooklyn changed anything fundamentally, but it felt so cavalier. That it wasn't presented as any sort of surprise drove home the reminder that most of what we considered canon was often just hastily composed fake mythos for ad copy, and the story that I've been devoted to might just be a narrative placeholder. There was a moment, vitally important in the emotional development of a geek, nerd, or whatever, when it sinks in all the way that the people creating whatever you've devoted yourself to, they're not as devoted to it as you are. It's just a job to them. This was my instance of that. How much sense did it make to be trying to work out the bigger relationships between the characters in the broader scope of their world? What was the point of keeping meticulous mental and physical lists and chronologies of Mario's friends, enemies, worlds, abilities, and all that? What did it matter if I could point out that Noko Nokos, exponential Troopas, were only found in Sarasa Land in one game? Why should I care so much if Mario's makers couldn't care so much? It didn't register until much later, but this was probably a turning point for me as much as it was for Mario. Young adulthood coming into full effect, it was the best possible time to free up some mental space now that school and life choices were starting to count for something. I had to get ready for college and a career path to start charting. I had long since transitioned from filmmaking to game design as a dream trajectory. It was time to move on, if only a bit, from Mario and Nintendo, but not all at once. In 1996, I was a sophomore in high school. Bill Clinton was dutifully pretending that Bob Dole was any sort of challenge, but for me and millions of other NES gamers, the biggest thing happening was the Nintendo 64. They would use their new power to take games to the third dimension, and Mario would lead the way. The early images of Mario 64 promised something unique. A fully realized Mushroom Kingdom, explorable by a Mario who was a solid being. Truly, this was hope for the future, personified. Open exploration of a virtual world, the dream of gamers from the beginning, would finally be realized by Mario, as it should be. The future of video games would remain in what were its rightful hands. Super Mario 64 was, of course, a thing of beauty. No challenger to Mario 3 in my heart, of course, but a worthy successor. It was the first time in forever that a game was so beautiful, I was desperate not to even finish it. Just make Mario run and jump around, exploring every cave and scaling every tower just to see what could be found. In my youth, I wanted nothing more than to simply inhabit Mario's world, and now I could. If this was merely the first step, we can only imagine what might come next. Let the others have their short-term fads of crashing bandicoots. Mario was back, and we were sure it was the future. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. No one, least of all Nintendo diehards awestruck by the experience, could have guessed at the time, but Mario 64 would be the last brief moment for a decade that a Mario game was the most important thing happening in video games. Desertion. Unfortunately for Nintendo, while they were busily consumed with crafting the masterpiece, the world had changed. In the early 90s, the ability to store information on CD-ROMs had revolutionized the world of computers. It was clear to everybody that CDs would be the future of video games. Everybody except for Nintendo. Developers who had been aching to bring the power of PC games to consoles were aghast by Nintendo's insistence to stick with cartridges. But unlike before, now they had a viable escape option. Sony was only too happy to snap them up, and a sea change was signaled when Squaresoft announced that Final Fantasy, a mega popular RPG franchise that had always been under Nintendo's umbrella, was going to Sony. For a time, veterans of the console war like myself tried to mount a vain, half-hearted defense, but the writing was on the wall. Final Fantasy VII became a classic. More and more longtime Nintendo developers bailed from the good ship Mario, and it soon became clear that the hemorrhaging of games and gamers from Nintendo would not stop, even for me, the Nintendo age was over. The decade of darkness. I don't know that there was an exact moment in time where I basically stopped playing video games, I just know that it did happen. I don't recall a single moment when I simply said, I'm done, since I never really quit cold turkey. All I can say for sure is that at one moment, the vast majority of my free time was spent playing, reading about, and thinking about games, and then it wasn't. Mostly, it was a semi-unconscious decision about time management. High school had me focused on my career prospects, my other internet fixation, movies, had remaking my other geek passion for filmmaking. For the first time I had a career path that seemed more attractive and plausible than game design. Get into the movies. Writing, directing, special effects, maybe even criticism. Just get into it somehow. Something had to give, and video games became that something. The thing is, as much as I was leaving games behind, I felt as though they were leaving me behind. Gaming was rapidly changing from a geek subculture to something like the mainstream. And with more of my attention diverted elsewhere, I recognized it less and less every time I look. Even Nintendo wasn't the same I'd grown up with. Their new cash cow Pokemon had become a mainstream phenomenon, bigger and faster than Mario ever had. And so, that was that. I played the new Mario games that came out, but I just didn't have the burning desire like I used to. My job at Blockbuster, which I had taken, had led me to what seemed at the time like a stroke of fortune. An older gentleman, who will remain nameless, came in asking if he could leave some flyers. It turns out he was starting up a film criticism show for local cable access TV, and he was looking for some talent. Store policy said that I'd tell him no, but it said nothing about me volunteering for it. I was hired to do the show along with this person and a female co-host. The resulting show was what you would expect from local public access, but it was exposure and a chance to work my craft such as it was. I was the colorful member of the team, the young guy with the wild opinions and the film knowledge. It was fun while it lasted. I had never gotten much of a sense that anything was off about the guy running the show. I knew he was fairly conservative politically, ex-military, but it had never come up in any kind of negative way. But upon the release of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, and the controversy surrounding it seemed to change him somehow. I was certain they both knew I'd seen the film and hadn't cared for it, and expected it would make a good show when we sat down to review it. Instead, I got a phone call and a terrifying life experience. My employer, although for the record I actually wasn't being paid, technically, summoned me to a meeting in his van in an empty parking lot early in the morning. He did freelance security work and that he was on the job. I showed up to meet him. He presented me with a printout of a scathing blog review I had posted after seeing the film the first time, and he wanted to know what I had against Jesus Christ. Unwisely, I offered that my objection was to the rampant anti-Semitism of the film, and I was told they had Schindler's List, now this is our turn. I was then told that he would use the passion discussion to promote the film's positive message. If I didn't go along with it, my time on the show would be over. And that was that. I never heard from him again, but I know his show didn't last that long without me. I'm told he'd behaved in a manner that disturbed the production staff during the taping of that episode, and my name had come up, but nothing ever came of it. My ongoing friendship with a co-worker from the first Blockbuster was able to finagle me a job with him at Best Buy after I quit, where I soon found myself moved from a morbid grind in the appliances department to the DVD, music, and video games section. That was the profit-driving centerpiece of any big electronics store. The skill set I had translated to selling games pretty handily. It was hard to be around video games and not be drawn back towards them, but I had been nudging my way back for a while, anyway. Gaming had changed in my absence, and was one of those changes had been that the console in your room was no longer the sole home of the serious gamer. This change had been led by some old friends. I don't think I ever said I was done with Mario, but even if I had, he wasn't done with me. Daybreak. For most of my time between the Blockbuster and Best Buy jobs, part of my regular schedule included weekend nighttime hangouts with my fellow employees, which involved playing video games. Halo was the game of choice, not my favorite thing, but soon it was discovered that the GameCube Mario Party and Super Smash Bros. Titles were better compatible with drunken revelry. What these did spur me to do was start paying more attention to my own games department and spend more time browsing gaming websites and game stores. And it was during one such jaunt of casual browsing that something extraordinary caught my eye. Boxes labeled NES Classics. What I saw next to those would have induced an honest-to-God spit take. A Game Boy Advance painted to resemble an NES. I had to have it. Impulsive, yes. I was unable to resist the opportunity to carry the good old days in my pocket, but now I needed some games. What I managed to miss during my break was that Nintendo's power and influence had grown, not shrunk, in the realm of the handhelds. There were Mario games, lots of Mario games. Re-releases of the classics, and our new games was my constant companion, particularly useful for passing time sitting in the car after work, waiting for the rest of the house to go to sleep before I headed home. I promise that last part isn't as pathetic as it sounds. You see, around the same time I picked up another hobby, making videos on the internet. Putting videos together scratched my filmmaking itch, but still living at home meant the only times I could have enough quiet and computer access to actually make use of it was when everybody else was in bed. What's old is new. As it turned out, I wasn't the only Generation NES 20-something using Nintendo handhelds to reconnect with the burgeoning retro scene. Publishers were seeing the numbers, and new games cast in the old-school style started to fill up the shelves. In 2005, Nintendo got in on the act in a big way. The first wholly new Mario Universe side-scroller in a decade would be 2005's Super Princess Peach, which took the long overdue step of having Princess Peach do the fighting herself to rescue Mario and Luigi. Then the man himself returned a year later. New Super Mario Bros. Bumped the character models up to present-day incarnations, but otherwise presented a back-to-basics approach. A classic side-scroller modeled primarily on Mario Bros. 1, linear levels, power-ups, and Bowser castles. While it may not have blown the minds of longtime devotees, it had succeeded at its goal, giving both original fans and newbies something that was at once new and familiar, and the sales spoke for themselves. It's a solid game, but it honestly falls in the average zone when judged to the other games in the series. But if you had told me that this amusing, glossy revival signaled the beginning of a full-fledged rebirth for Mario and Nintendo, I would have written it off as wishful thinking. In 2008, I was spending a lot of time online, re-engaged with a gaming community that in many ways not only did not resemble the one I had left, but seemed openly hostile to it, a mirror image that hated itself. The feeling of inclusiveness that I remembered, perhaps in rose-colored exaggeration, born from gaming and nerd culture having originated as one and the same and thus sympathetic to misfits and the socially oppressed, had been replaced by a crude bullying culture, a cruel horde dedicated to shunning the old iconography with any attempt to build a new one beyond the borders of the online multiplayer military shooter that had come to dominate. Whereas I had once recalled a culture that had flaunted its own pseudo-multiculturalism, given the sheer volume of the media that came from another country, I now found a rabidly xenophobic culture that would not only happily purge the weird Eastern influences of the past, but also resisted the injection of any perspective that didn't align with that of a white heterosexual man. I was told that gaming had matured, but from my perspective it had only aged into adolescence. The childlike innocence of gamer culture I remembered had morphed into the persona of an ignorant, hormonal teenage boy, hateful of women, fiercely protective of privilege, eager to prove machismo, and contemptible. Of course this culture despised Nintendo, representing as it did a fusion of all they sought not to be. The Wii was a group activity where they cultivated detachment, colorful and exuberant where they prized darkness and edginess, and inherently foreign where they had come to worship the digital age version of American muscle. I dumped my frustrations with what the medium and its public face had become, crystallized by the reveal that the lead of the rebooting Bionic Commando franchise was to be transformed into yet another scowling, stubbly lunkhead, into a YouTube video about the declining standard of character design in games. It was Game Over Thinker Episode 1, A Matter of Character. I got a vague sense that I had more to say and could maybe do a series of this. Screw Attack posted that first episode to its front page, and suddenly my YouTube channel, my email, and the blog were inundated with visitors. My videos were being posted to blogs and feeds across the web, and all at once the Game Overthinker went from being one of my hobbies to being a thing I was now in charge of. Sudden E-fame was quite a thing. I could not be prepared for what happened next. EscapistMagazine.com saw my stuff on YouTube and wanted me to join the team. They wanted a film critic. Holy shit. In my real work life, I had finally surrendered to a soul-sucking data entry job. so these developments could not have come at a better time. I segued off into another part-time retail job, working the cappuccino counter at Borders, but now I had a real career to build on the side and hopefully do full-time. Peace in our time. I wasn't the only one going through the end of an era and an exciting new beginning. The so-called console wars that had in part created the once problematic family-friendly identity, which Nintendo had now re-embraced, had long since abated. However, their history was a vital memory for both the industry and gamers. Even fans who were too young to have witnessed the war had managed to absorb through pop cultural osmosis the idea that for some reason Sonic and Mario were enemies. But in 2007, the last cultural remnant of the console wars was put to rest. Gamers may have dreamed of seeing Mario and Sonic team up or fight, but whatever anyone had in mind, few could have predicted the out-of-the-blue announcement in 2007 of a Mario-Sonic crossover in the form of an Olympics-themed minigame collection. If nothing else, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games was an above-average game of its type, but however noteworthy and nifty it was to see the two icons standing together, the game wasn't quite the climax the iconic rivalry might have deserved in the eyes of many. That would come later. Sonic would appear alongside Mario in the Super Smash Bros. Brawl, the Wii installment of the mascot fighting game series. In addition to its multiplayer mode, Brawl featured a single-player story mode that placed the roster of characters in a side-scrolling platform adventure into what could only be called an orgy of retro gaming titled The Subspace Emissary. In the final moments of the game, when players face off against a mysterious final villain, none other than Sonic himself appears out of nowhere to mortally wound him and allow for the story to conclude. To say that playing through Subspace Emissary was close to a religious experience for me in general, Link meets Yoshi, Rob's stormtroopers, Kirby fighting Bowser and Ganondorf's space cannon, would be putting it mildly. But even after that, seeing Mario and Sonic together in a real game, being able to fight each other no less, felt more like a real closure than it had any right to for a grown man. Thus, at long last, ended the rivalry of Mario and Sonic, now united as avatars of the Golden Age, fighting against its own fading, and thus far winning. The next level. And so we come to the present. In 2009, Nintendo released new Super Mario Bros. Wii. I bought it. I enjoyed it. It got me through what was a very stressful holiday season that year. I sort of figured that was that. Retro platformers were a niche genre, but then everybody bought it. New Super Mario Bros. Wii turned out to be one of the biggest releases ever on the system. It wasn't just nostalgic fanboys, it was kids, parents, families. The Mario formula was as addictive as ever, and now its new multiplayer format pulled a new generation into the fold. It sold 10 million units, the fastest selling single console game in history. After all this time, my old friend, the form in which he was most comfortable, was deservedly so the gold standard. In the wake of New Super Mario Bros. Wii's success, the Mario merchandise market exploded in a way it never had when I was young enough to have justifiably gorged upon it. Mario toys are a sight all over, and I won't pretend I don't have a few choices decorating my home right now. Oh, and speaking of homes, as Mario was settling back onto his throne, things turned around for me as well. My hard work for the internet has started to pay off in numbers that allowed me to do it full time. I made enough money to move out of my parents' house into a place of my own, a life transition that spurred me to buckle down and write this book. So it's not just a retrospective of Mario 3, but a record of my last time playing it in the home where I played it for the first time. Moving into a home of my own was a little chaotic, not in the least because Evangeline, my beloved grandparent, passed away a few days before I was scheduled to move. I didn't want to draw the process out. I wanted to get as much of my gear installed in the new place on the first day, which ultimately led to a set of sleepless days worth of furniture assembly, shelf construction, and general life building. Part of that meant frequently heading back home to dig out as many usable items as I could from my closets and drawers. I found a lot of suddenly useful random items, extension cords, USB cables, batteries, but also a lot of lost keepsakes to keep with me because, well, you know. I opened up one box and found my childhood, the games, my games, everything that had survived from my earlier days, NES, SNES, N64 games, plus corresponding consoles and other equipment. At the very bottom was my original NES, a little faded, but otherwise as recognizable as it was the first day I hooked it up. In a separate area, I found my worn and well-read first issue of Nintendo Power. I resolved immediately that those devices, the games, would live again, and put the rest of my homemaking on hold while I set about doing that. With the half-constructed skeletons of more important accoutrements of living leaning against walls, their construction on hold, I spent the night cleaning cartridges and connectors with rubbing alcohol and Q-tips. I tested every game and played my original copy of Mario 3 on my original NES, and just like that, my new house became a home. Mario is still here. 25 years later, a 2D Mario Brothers side-scroller is carrying the banner for the new generation. He's still here, and so am I. I would like to think that we would thank one another for that, if possible. Believe it or not, the Wii U I purchased on launch day was defective, but we deal with what we must. A few days later, I showed up, hoping to get a new one, and one of those days I had an encounter that stuck with me and probably will forever. I was standing outside in November cold outside of a local Target. After about 20 minutes of waiting, I was joined by another pair of early birds, a young mother and her 2 children. One was a boy of about 6 years old, the other was a toddler wrapped in a solid cocoon of winter wear and cradled against the mom's shoulder. I got the sense we would be there for the same thing. They were picking up a Wii U, and I could tell this despite the fact we only said hello to each other. I stress this is not by some psychic intuition, but because the boy was making it pretty clear. He was excitable to the point of bouncing. His attire told the rest of the tale. Mario t-shirt, baseball cap, backpack, sneakers. I looked down at him, smiled and nodded. He looked up at me, realizing that I also happened to be wearing a Mario shirt. One from my era, with a look of quizzical surprise. This big older guy knows Mario too? Yes, I do, kid. Yes, I do. Mario belongs to him more than he belongs to me, even if I've known him longer. Because Mario and the very act of play fundamentally belong to the kids. It's not to say that they can't be part of adult life, it's to say that it is what it is. I am the man I am today for many reasons, my parents, my grandparents, friends, and family, but also because of Mario, whose adventures filled my lonely hours, fueled my dreams, gave me a consequential sense of stability in a manner I never would have expected to led down a twisted, roundabout path, my own career and prosperity. I wouldn't dream of denying that kid to have the same grand adventure, and I only hope Mario will be as good a friend to him as he was to me. And so, in addition to writing this book for myself, for people like me, for game designers, developers, journalists, anybody else who'd been looking for a book that looked at a game in this way, I also write for that boy, for all the kids like him to show Mario in games now and might find intrigue or benefit in knowing what came before. I would like to imagine that someday, somewhere, a copy of this book will be picked up by a young Mario fan who would never consider that their hobby could hold deeper truth, or be looked at as an object of meaning and art, and they will appreciate it all the more. Well, Bob, that was certainly something. That was an hour long of my time that I put into this, and guess what? We're not even a third of the way through this book. You want to know more, don't you? You want to see me staying up late at night and torturing myself with this gobshite, don't you? You fucking people. I'm Larson Halleck. Please live a life worth living.